Hey, welcome to the Mend Podcast. Again, your ad-free, clickbait-free podcast that's just all about helping you get more success on the water. We call it the Mend Podcast because we fix problems for anglers. That's the goal anyway. Sometimes I feel like we make more problems by complicating things, but we're going to try not to do that. It is a technical sport, if you want to make it that way. I got a returning podcast guest. The first time Patrick was on the podcast was one of the most downloaded episodes. What do you think of that, Patrick?
Wow, that's I guess I'm saying I'm shocked because I would have never thought that.
Yeah, it was that was one of the most downloaded episodes, except for one random episode that was about fishing beetles in Chile, and I think that some bot accidentally downloaded it like 300,000 times. But
Funny.
yeah, so I think I mean I feel like you got a ton to share. And on today's podcast, we're going to talk about tying and kind of the practicality in tying. For those that didn't listen to that original podcast, will you reintroduce yourself with just a little background so folks know who they're chatting with today?
Sure. So my name is Patrick Kilby. For the last, oh, I don't know, 8 years, I guess, I've been working for product development here for Farbank Enterprises and specifically within RIO, managing and leading the fly aspect of it. So fly development. RIO had never sold flies prior to that, and so we've been building this up, and yeah, it's been fun.
And so I mean, the fly tying business, there's obviously lots of logistics like building anything or manufacturing anything, but you're, I think most, the most passionate discipline of your job or the most interesting discipline of your job is fly design and creation, right?
That's definitely the art and science coming together. It's not a spreadsheet. It's not another meeting. It's getting to sit down and solve a problem for myself as an angler, which then in turn should solve problems for other anglers.
Well, I love the fact when you come at this from just such a raw and genuine angling perspective. There are there are people that are tie to tie, and I know you do a little bit of that, but your background is tying to fish. When did
Mhm.
you first start tying flies and why?
Um, so I started tying, I'm thinking I was 12 or 13. We had cousins living in North Idaho, and I got to go up and visit them, and they taught me how to tie a woolly bugger and a renegade. And then when their dad got home that night, he took us out in their canoe to a local pond or lake, and I caught some perch on the renegades that I had tied. And it was just like, well, this is awesome. This is something that I want to do. This was fun. I just created this thing. I didn't come up with it. I just put it on the hook a few hours earlier. So that was when I started. And then I just went through phases. I tied at my kitchen table for many years, on and off, until my mom would get frustrated and tell me to clean it up. Um, I tied on like an old TV tray in my broken recliner during college, and and then all my stuff was stolen out of a. I got home at like 1 in the morning after a fishing trip. Everything was sitting in the boat out in front of our house. And when I woke up in the morning, it was all gone. I hadn't brought it inside. I regret that decision. And so had to start completely over. I had nothing. And so I bought some flies to get started and kind of fill some immediate gaps, and then just started about tying again, to, start to build it back up.
Yeah, and so that's a good story. So renegade and a woolly bugger in a pond in a canoe. And
Mhm.
man, the more of these podcasts I do, the more I realize we that work in the industry all had such extremely humble beginnings. I didn't come from a fly fishing family.
Mhm.
I fly fished a little bit, which I've shared in podcasts in prior episodes, kind of what my background was. It was a gear family, and it wasn't until we were failing to catch fish that were eating bugs that we, elected to try fly. But
Mhm.
uh, the first fly that I tied uh, was a chronomid. It was literally nothing more than black thread on a hook with a bead. It was a one ingredient, well, if you count the bead, a two ingredient fly. And it was at a place which you're probably familiar with is Woodhouse Loop Ponds. I'm not sure if you know
Mhm.
where those, yeah, you know where those are out there, just
Yeah.
north of the canyon here. And, Patrick has some family in the Ellensburg area here, so it's always a good excuse for him to get over here and fish. But I was out at the Woodhouse Loop Ponds, and I'd been hearing about chironomids, which I thought were called chironomoids at the time, because I'd been reading fly fishing books and magazines.
Yeah.
I didn't have a real good in-person mentor, but it was literally black thread on a hook. And it wasn't just a little thread to make like a nice clean body. It was like way too much thread. It was
Hmm.
just a black nugget, with a bead on there.
Hmm.
But man, was I proud of myself. And it was out of the, one of the local ponds. They used to put stockers in Woodhouse Loop ponds. I was a freshman in college. And I started tying. My motivation was I was broke as a joke. I mean, just had like literally zero money. I remember buying flies. There wasn't a fly shop in town at the time. The first fly shop in in our area didn't open until 1997. It was later 1997. And so I had to buy flies at the local pawn shop. No joke. And I remember buying flies. I mean, I'd take the change out of my ashtray and I'd go in and buy two or three flies. And it's like, man, I was so into fly fishing that if I was going to sustain this, I had to figure out how to tie and I had to figure out how to utilize, a limited amount of materials to get as much out of it as I could.
Hmm.
And so for me, my motivation to get into tying was I didn't have any other choice. I couldn't spend $2 a fly
Hmm.
every time I wanted to, make a risky cast.
Hmm. Yeah, funny because I learned that Renegade, which is, typically a brown hackle, a white hackle, or a cream hackle, and then that gold tinsel in between. And and that's more materials than I thought was necessary to to kind of solve what I was trying to do at first. And because I would go up into these little creeks up in the Cascade Mountains, and every little slower pool that was kind of shady had, which looking back, they were probably little, midges, right, bouncing around in there in the shade, and trout would eat them. And so I just started tying it with one material. So I just used a grizzly hackle and just palmered it up the entire thing, and that was it. Just one
Like
grizzly
a
hackle.
like a woolly worm with no base.
Yep, and pretty tight, like keeping it like a dry fly hackle, really, really tight together up the whole shank. And I'm talking on a size 14 or 16 hook, but that's all it was, is just one hackle on a hook. And that was all I fished with for, I don't know, a couple of years. And and in a setting like that, I mean, you think of like a Griffiths gnat without a base, as you said, there's no peacock in it. That's essentially what I was using. And so it's like, talk about cheap start, like one pack of dry fly hackle and one set of hooks, and I'm good. Um, and then, yeah, I mean, I had cousin or relatives that would take me fishing, and they would offer to buy these things from me, which I thought was just like incredible, and I had no idea. So I think I was getting like a quarter, 25 cents a fly or something. And I thought that was insanely good. And I think, looking back, they were obviously being very kind and supportive, because they'd have me open the box and they would look in and they'd ask what I'd recommend, or they just pick some things out that they liked. And so, I always liked going fishing with them, because they were pretty encouraging. I think the fly I was trying to tie was called a bivisible. Um, but again, I left off the other colored hackle. So anyway, on both.
Uh, yeah, some of it popped into my mind, that, the story of you being able to tie flies with just one or two materials, find success. And then somebody offering to buy these flies from you, and then here you are, what, 30 plus years later,
Hmm.
you get this, what I think most would describe as a dream job where you get to go to your laboratory, solve problems for anglers, make flies that not only are, I think there's an element that a fly should be fun to look at. You should be excited and have some stoke when you tie that on your line, but also the fish have to be receptive to it. It's got to be a functional pattern,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
But the story of Jim and Dick Cabela, how their business started. Are you familiar with the origins of Cabela's?
I've read it. I don't remember it though right now.
So maybe I'll get a little bit of this incorrect, but as I remember reading this, they started selling flies down at the barber shop,
Mm.
and they would tie flies. Guys come to the barber shop, tie a few flies, then they're like, man, we're doing pretty good making, a quarter a fly, whatever the heck they were
Hmm.
selling them for. And later on, they decided to run a little classified ad in the paper and they began selling flies. And then pretty soon, they obviously grew it into, the biggest sporting goods, franchise
Hmm.
on the history of the planet. Obviously, even Rome falls eventually. But I always thought that was such a neat story with such, humble roots.
Hmm.
That couple of young guys ambitious to tie some flies, and they're like, "Oh man, people like what I'm doing here. Great, it's a
Hmm.
marketable product."
There was a
Y-
point where I traded flies for haircuts with a barber in town because he knew I was into it, and so he didn't fly fish. He trolled gear in lakes, but he liked fishing carry specials. That was what he liked to troll. And so I offered to tie him some, and I asked him what color. And so he gave me the color, but I went and looked, and there were multiple colors of these things that people liked. So he wanted six, I believe. And I went and tied a dozen of what the color he wanted was. And then I tied some others of the other colors. And then I just kind of presented this to him and said, well, here's the six that you wanted, but here's some others in case you're interested. And then he just took all of them and then traded me out for the haircut. And then we learned it was extra. So he ended up paying me on top of that. So I was getting a free haircut and walking out with a few bucks in my pocket. And that was awesome. I was like 16 years old and driving myself up to the barber shop, making a few bucks and coming out looking fresh. So it's great.
That's an awesome story. I so yeah, my origins into tying, and the reason I think this is relevant maybe for discussion or people listening is there are different motivations to get into tying. For me, it was a financial motivation. I loved fly fishing and I wanted to do a lot of it, and I had to be able to get flies. I had more time, being that I was a freshman in college. I had more spare time than I did economic resources. So I would scrap together, hooks here and there. I mean, I can't remember where all I would pick up hooks, but I certainly wasn't ordering them or getting them from a fly shop. It was usually like a big sporting good, an old, which unfortunately there aren't a lot of these little kind of boutique sporting goods store anymore, but they always have seem to have some cheap must-add hooks, hiding back in the corner that have been there for 20 years. You could get 100 pack of them, and they'd work for a dry fly, they'd work for a nymph, all sorts of different things. I would scale up materials for bigger flies and kind of make a small hook work for a bigger fly and a big hook work for a small fly. And then I would just raid the craft stores.
Mm.
Craft stores are like a fly tires, we're going to come full circle because I think in the long run, buying the exact material for the fly allows you to have better products with less materials, like good
Oh, sure.
colors, good color matches. But we didn't have a fly shop. There wasn't anybody selling materials. I think the closest fly shop was maybe an hour away, but I was broke anyway, so I would raid the
Mhm.
craft stores, foam, and then you remember those little cushy balls with all the little rubber legs, going
Mhm.
everywhere, like like little spider looking critter.
Sure.
Those made great rubber legs. So
Mhm.
I would get foam, I'd get rubber legs, and that was before the chubby Chernobyl was even a thing.
Mhm.
It was just a twinkle in your eye at that point, Patrick. Um, but we were tying chubby Chernobyls before they had a name. I mean, for many years, and the dry fly fishing back then was just so much better. Foam and foam and rubber legs flies used to be, I mean, God, a lot of people viewed them as kind of the Antichrist, like
Mm.
traditional anglers, but a lot of shops didn't even sell those, larger style, Chernobyl ants. So tied every iteration of Chernobyl ant that you could possibly imagine, and most of those materials from the yarn to the thread to the foam all came from the craft stores
Mm. Nice.
at
Yeah.
a mean discount. And then later on, I did dabble in commercial tying at one point
Mm.
for one day. I tied was during the winter, and I'd heard this story from a guy like, oh yeah, this guy he ties flies and he does it as an off season from guiding, and he likes to go do a little cross country skiing in the morning, and then he'll go and he'll tie a handful of a few dozen flies, and that's his kind of his off season gig. And I was like, oh man, I really want to do that, and I think I went in too hard because I didn't go cross country skiing in the morning to like get fresh air. I just got up and drank 2 pots of coffee and tied 12 dozen ex caddis,
Yeah.
and then I was done.
Yeah.
It was literally, and then I was left with all these extra materials because I filled the initial order and I was like, that's it for me. I'm gonna go work at Safeway.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was it was stealing too much of it was stealing too much of the fun, from me. But what motivates people, like from your experience, you can explain your background in fly tying retail, when you would work directly with tires, but like for what are the different categories of people that jump into tying?
Well, I think we've been talking about, kind of ourselves as one category where you're just kind of like, you don't have the funds to go, buy the stuff that you'd like to fish. Maybe there's not even a shop close by to do that. So you're just trying to like, fill that need that you have to go learn how to fly fish and, piece it together. I think people get into it. Like I've even met people, it's rare, but I've met people who have tied flies and never fly fished. Like it was just like a fun hobby for them to do, kind of like knitting or something else. But which I was just blown away at when I heard that. So there are some people that just see it purely as a hobby. And then I think you have the commercial tires that are trying to make a buck off of it and, cranking out as much stuff as they can. Some of those people I know even own a fly shop, and so they're backfilling a lot of their own inventory throughout the winter, so they can, have more profits coming in off those flies than if they were to buy them. Um, and then you have the kind of the designers that are tying stuff to, create something new, and they're just constantly tinkering at the vise. And then you just get those, it's a mix somewhere in between, right? So you have somebody that starts off tinkering, finds some stuff that works, but they also want a commercial tie. you know um I'm totally forgetting his name right now, but um creator of the Elk caddis, that's what he did. Like he tied all these great bugs, and then he created his own catalog, and he was selling his own flies out of his own catalog, taking orders and filling these bulk orders. um and I don't know, it's pretty amazing to me. I don't have the patience for it either. Like I took one commercial order when I was working in a fly shop, and I think so many people would come in and they just assume that because you worked in a fly shop, you tied custom flies for people. And uh, I always said no, that I'm not going to do that. And then finally, I kind of thought about it. I was like, I need to be able to say yes to this, and make the decision theirs. And so I was like, I'll just charge more than I feel comfortable with. And then they'll say no, like that's too much. Right. And apparently I didn't even come close to charging too much, because they were like, oh, yeah, no problem. And so then I ended up tying, like you said, 12 dozen ish or something crazy, that I have all these rogue steelhead flies and whatnot, and half pounder flies. So when it came time to pick the flies up, um, they asked how much, and I told them, and they were like, okay, no problem, I'll be by. And I just felt so much guilt for that I was going to take that much money from them. So then I worked in a shop, so I went and bought not one, but two CNF boxes, like the really nice, waterproof fly boxes, and put all their flies in that, and then made that part of the presentation to them. Like I just handed them these two beautiful boxes full of flies that I had tied, and just gave away a ton of my profit margin. You know what I mean? Just out of guilt. And then I was like, this is why I shouldn't be doing this. Like I can't even handle the own guilt of charging, something appropriate. But anyway.
That's the that's the story of a typical broke ass artist right there, man. Musicians and fly tires, dude.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me in getting I became a real ambitious tire for a lot of years, and then eventually my guide business, got so busy that it was impractical to try to supply all of my flies
Mm-hmm.
for my guided clients because I just when you guide all day and then you go home, you tie, a half dozen bugs, then you get up and over a cup of coffee, you tie another half dozen bugs, and that might get you through a day of fishing. You wind up you bordering on burnout. And
Mm-hmm.
so eventually I got to the point where I was only tying very specialty flies. But as I look back at tying, like when I was in that stage of fishing and pre-guiding, I had several years where I was a really avid angler pre-guiding, and I think that speaks to a lot of the listeners of the podcast, like really enthusiastic, ultimate weekend warrior types. They savor that experience on the water. And when you're in that stage, you want to try a lot of different types of flies. Maybe you want to fish a nymph and you want to discover things that give you a little bit of an advantage over the other anglers on the water, maybe something the fish haven't been offered before. And it can get really expensive dabbling in experimental patterns when you buy them at the retail level. And so I was able to tie a lot of different little iterations of the same things. I can remember lots of flies that I experimented with and they didn't work, and I throw them in a Hills Brothers coffee can on my bench, and then eventually that coffee can would get full. But in the process of experimenting with all these different colors and patterns and styles and weights and buoyancy techniques, like how a dry fly floats, is really critical to me. I've always said that my the flies I tie, I know how they behave. I know they're going to roll over upright. I know they're not going to spin up my tippet and all these intangibles that you can't see when a fly is like in a bin in the fly shop.
Mm-hmm.
When I tie them, I know what's going into them and I know how they're going to float on the water. So I think tying allows anglers to experiment with just one or two or three of these, and when they have success on them, likely the material package that they bought will provide them materials to tie dozens and dozens and dozens of these with small permutations, within that that chassis or that product family. So for me, I think it was a lot about experimentation without this large scale economic investment of one the time of going to a store. I could probably tie a few flies by the time I run down to a shop and back. And I can tie them morning of, specifically for my outing that day. And then the third thing is like the stoke factor of like going on a big trip. I can remember going, I cut my teeth steelhead fishing on the Grand Ronde River, and I remember how exciting it was the week prior to the trip, tying patterns that I was specifically going to fish for steelhead the following week. And so it allowed me to get to the river before I even got to the river and have an experience on the vise, prior.
No, it definitely builds up that anticipation and, gets you excited, gets you looking forward to it. Um, and yeah, I mean, there's a lot of excitement to reaching the river and pulling out one of those flies you just tied. Um, and hopefully you get to tie it on. I remember finding by the way, Altroth was the name of the fly tire I was trying to think of with the Elk Hair Caddis. But another person that I really looked up to was Bill McMillan, and he had a fly called the paintbrush that I thought looked beautiful. And when you read about it, it was like, oh man, he's doing all this amazing stuff with steelhead and coho and everything on it. And he's on the Washougal where I'm going to be fishing, and I'm going to tie one up. And I tied one up and I had it in my box and I was ready to deploy it. And I remember opening the box, taking the fly out, putting it on the bow of the drift boat, and we were anchored in the river for a minute. And I was just going to set it up, and an east wind blew it into the river before I ever even got to tie it on. I was like, Oh my gosh. Of course, I only tied one, right? And it's on a super heavy hook. So it just sinks like a rock immediately. So never got to fish it. Uh, and then I was so bummed that it happened. I didn't have the heart to go even tie another one. I was just like, whatever. That wasn't meant to be. So,
I had something similar happen, but it wasn't with flies I bought. But I remember me telling you that I used to buy my flies at the Kittitas County Trading Company. I mean, you could buy a VCR, a used chainsaw, an AR-15, or flies.
yeah.
All, like kind of a one-stop shop there. But I remember buying a few flies there, and I was a total neophyte, and I went down to the Yakima River, and I had, oh, maybe 6 or 8 flies I'd bought. I was like, oh, this will be good for the day. And of course, being an irresponsible young angler, I'd put them in like a kind of a miniature Plano box, where they're not stuck into foam. They'll fall out if you're not careful.
Mm-hmm.
And I was standing upstream of Tandem, and I wanted to change flies, and I didn't know the names of the flies or anything. I was a total greenhorn. And
Mm-hmm.
I opened that Plano box and ended up dumping out the 6 to 8 flies that I had bought, like literally with every last dollar that day. And
Mm-hmm.
for me, that was probably the turning point where I was like, I have got to figure out how to tie these flies myself. But yeah,
Yeah.
they floated away. I didn't catch any fish. I got skunked. And then to pour salt on the wound, a guide boat came by and caught a really nice fish within like direct sight of me. And I was like, that struggle fest that I was having really lit a fire under me to figure this out.
Mm.
And I was like, if somebody's having success out here, hopefully it'll eventually be me.
Yeah.
Um, One thing I want to dive into, so there are lots of reasons that you've seen people get into tying, the other thing is I want you to explain really quickly the difference between and eventually I want to get into like just really practical tips for tying, like entry level tying. Maybe somebody has materials and they were a tyer in the past and they got frustrated, or maybe we'll
Mm-hmm.
inspire them to jump back into it.
Mm-hmm.
But I want you to explain the difference between impressionistic and realistic flies. I think
Mm-hmm.
those are kind of there's obviously some merging of those two, but can you explain the differences between those two? Because I think that the flies that we were talking about earlier, like the Renegade, and then let's just say the Naked Griffith's Gnat that you were tying, whatever, maybe it had a name. Uh, those would
Okay.
fall into the category of like impressionistic, and there's a reason fish see those as food. And then I want you to explain the difference for like realistic.
Mm-hmm. Um, so I think the easiest way to explain impressionistic and realistic is to look at, I used to always say, look at the Kaufman stone that, people that understand a lot of flies and kind of resonate with some. The Kaufman stone was pretty popular up there with the stimulator, right? That Randall did. Very, on a curved hook. It had all the little wing pad things on it, had a vinyl rib down the body, the forked tail. It had all these elements of realism. And um, and I have a box full of them. But then cut over, and so I'll say that one's realistic looking. Then cut over to like a rubber legs, silly leg stone, that type of stuff, where there's no rhyme or reason to a head or a tail. You don't know if it's coming or going upside down, sideways. You just don't know. There's just legs and a body, right? And so as one is tumbling down the river, the Kaufman stone, a realistic one, it might it might even look dead to a fish because it may not be behaving the way a real live stonefly should behave. But because it's so lifelike looking, it might actually appear dead, like something they don't even want to eat. Whereas,
By dead, you mean like organic debris, stick,
no,
twig,
like if
leaf.
it's a real stonefly that's been injured or dead and it's still floating down the river, tumbling down the river, but they want to eat one that's still alive, meaning, it's swimming. You can see it struggling to try to right itself and get over to shore or whatever. It's trying to recling to a rock. But this one is dead. And so it's just free tumbling down the river and there's no life in it. Whereas a rubber legs or a silly leg stone, it can tumble down the river, but you can't tell if it's got a front or a back or whatever, top or bottom. So no matter what angle you see this thing at, it just looks buggy. It just looks like it could be their food source. So that gives the impression of a stonefly that's tumbling down the river, but you can't tell if it's swimming right side up or not. And so just those two alone, you have, a good example of both. One is very impressionistic and tends to catch more fish, in my opinion. It always has for me. Um, so I think, I put flies in three categories ultimately. One is that uh, impressionistic that we just talked about. There's kind of like hyper realistic, and the more you get hyper realistic, the more it just becomes art and it's not fishable. Like it looks exactly like the thing, but it'll never fish. It's just going to be lifeless in the water. And then you have, kind of semi realistic. So something in between there that's it's not art anymore. It's not so well tied that it looks like the exact thing, but it's more real than an impressionistic fly is, if that makes sense. So I would say that's where my lane is, where I try to tie most of the time, is kind of in that semi-realistic or semi-impressionistic, however you want to describe it. But just enough lifelike aspects to look. So when you look at it, one of my tests is like if my family members who don't fly fish really, if they pick it up and go, "Oh, is that a grasshopper?" and it's a sculpin or something, I'm like, whoa, like I'm not even close. You know what I mean? So if I'm that far off for somebody, then I'm like, maybe I need to revisit this or get something. I don't know. But if they pick it up and go, "Oh, that's a cool grasshopper," then I'm like, all right, perfect. I've nailed it.
I think back to your you know your fly that you originally were talking about, because I think it's a really good case study, is dry flies are one of those things that are largely impressionistic, that don't necessarily look like a replica of the bug. They're intended to look like a replica of the bug that's flapping and moving and struggling. For instance, a flying mosquito looks like a little blob. And we'll just say mosquito because they're very common. Everybody knows what a mosquito hovering around in front of their face looks like. It's just a fuzzy little blob because it's moving and struggling and its wings are active. It's not dead or still. And these dry flies that we fish, like a traditional Adams or any thorax tied dry fly that has a hackle, which is a feather, and hackle comes in, a thousand different permutations of size and color and style and barb density and etc. But that hackle is what's wrapped around a thorax, like a traditional old school thorax style mayfly. I mean, we'll just say mayflies primarily. That bug doesn't necessarily, or that fly pattern doesn't necessarily look like the real bug. It looks like the in motion. And I think that's like a real misconception for people that are tying bugs and buying bugs is I've always felt like one of the jobs of the tying creator is to make the bug look like it's moving when it's not. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. You can do that with grizzly style material that's black and white that gives the impression of moving static. You could use hackle. I think hackle and elk hair and spiny microfibers that push on surface tension do a really nice job of making that bug look like it's fluttering and skittering and moving when it's not. So when you're tying bugs, there's an element of figuring out how to tie a pattern that looks like it's moving when it's not. And those to me fall into, dry flies fall largely into that impressionistic category. As soon as we get subsurface and we start talking about sculpin and leeches and nymphs, we begin to approach slightly more on that, that realistic half of the bell curve, I'd say.
Yeah, I think, and as a just one other example that you were, talking about here with the action is like, so you have a Chernobyl ant, and if you're looking at a Chernobyl ant or Chernobyl hopper from underneath as a fish would, you've got the body and you've got legs. And so you got the silhouette of the insect that they believe it is, which could be a stonefly or a grasshopper or whatever. And so it puts out that silhouette. Jump over to the chubby Chernobyl, and silhouette wise, it's going to look very, very, very similar to that first one. Body and legs touching the water. The difference is that gigantic double white wing on the chubby that, until I understood it, I was put off by it. I'm like, what in the world is this thing? And then once you realize why it's there and what it's for, of that big fluttering wing of a salmon fly, trying to leave the surface, then I owned that. I was like, man, I'm going to fish that as full as possible. So I would put my floatant in it, and then I had a wire dog brush, and I would reverse comb it forward to just fluff it up as wild as big as possible, and then fish it like that, because then it just gave that look of a big fluttering set of wings trying to get away. And you employ the right twitch at the right moment, and it's game on. So uh you know it when it doesn't make sense at first, it's just like, why would I ever fish that? And then once you realize why it's there, then you embrace it. um yeah, and I do think that from a commercial standpoint, we are tying for two audiences. We're tying for the fish, and we're trying to, lure the fisherman, the angler, to buy it, to pick it up, to look at it, to handle it, whatever. And so we refer to that as bin appeal. So the fly needs to look good. So that's always a debate, like, do I put these cool markings on top of this fly? It's a dry fly. Do I put these markings on top of a dry fly, knowing a fish will never see it? They'll never know it's there. But as the angler looks at that in a bin, they're like, whoa, look at that, right? That's a cool looking bug. And they're going to pick the thing up. And so those marks on top of that fly, I put there for the angler in that sees it in the bin. And, anyway, it's just,
Con-
I have two audiences.
Confessions from a fly designer. No, man, I think bin appeal is cool. I want to tie flies that I'm stoked out and I'm proud of. Back to the chubby Chernobyl and helping, folks, because this isn't stuff that you or I knew intuitively until we fished and tied a long time. But like the white wing on a chubby Chernobyl, for instance, by the time we put grease in it or floatant, we apply some type of grease or floatant. It's combed out, so there's hundreds of thousands potentially of microfibers in there. I mean, just lots of little microfibers. All of those microfibers now get little bubbles trapped on them. So now they're greasy, they're wet, they have lots of little bubbles, and then the sunlight pours through that. That creates an illusion of movement that it 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 doesn't we don't see it through the same lens as the fish. But when you look at that fly from underwater, and I've done this, on various YouTube videos over the years, I've taken cameras and put them underwater, underneath larger flies so that people can see the 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 function of sunlight pouring down through and backlighting some of those big wings. And it's really profound what those bugs look like. A Dave's hopper, a traditional old school, and it was Whitlock the one that originally coined the Dave's hopper.
Yeah, I think that was Steve Whitlock, I believe.
I mean, it makes sense. Okay, we'll just give Dave Whitlock credit. Somebody can put in the comments if it's not. But the Dave's hopper, right? Old school, natural fiber, no foam. A Dave's hopper is well, it's not an easy fly to tie. One, spinning
Mhm.
deer hair and getting it dense and compact is very difficult. So I would put that more in like the varsity tire category. But like the Dave's hopper, for instance, when you fish it on a shady or a dark day, it doesn't have the same presentation that it does on a sunny day. As soon as you take a Dave's hopper and you pour sunlight through it, this fly that really is very stiff and the materials don't have a lot of movement, not like a Chernobyl ant with rubber legs, but when you pour sunlight through a Dave's hopper, for instance, that fly all of a sudden comes to life as that fly rolls and ebbs and bobs and weaves down the river through current. And that light is constantly changing. Now, all of a sudden, that fly looks like it's kicking and struggling and moving and fighting for its life, and trout glob onto it. And so that's, an example of a fly that doesn't necessarily have a lot of movement, is fairly realistic, but I would say it's 50-50. It's right on that borderline of impressionistic versus realistic.
Mhm.
And you put sunlight through it, and all of a sudden it's an amazing pattern.
Mhm.
Hey, revisiting real quick, you were talking about like, a, a Scylla leg stone, a rubber leg stone. We've got two materials in that fly. If you take out weight and bead, lead or bead,
Mhm.
you've basically got some form of chenille, and then you've got rubber legs. A
Mhm.
two material fly that is literally one of the fishiest and best selling patterns, in the West, in the
Right.
world probably. And it's only two materials. And it looks the same from pretty much every angle you look at it. The belly is the same color as the back. The head and the tail are essentially, with the exception of a potential bead being on it, the head and the tail are identical. You don't know if
Mhm.
it's coming or going. You don't know what's up or down. That theory of it looking the same from all angles, is that the Brooks theory?
I'm not familiar with the Brooks theory, so I'm not.
I believe that's called the Brooks theory, and I want to say I read that in Gary Border's book on presentation, which I think is the greatest. If anybody can find a copy of it, I think it is the greatest fly fishing resource that you could ever do. The information is all 1000% still relevant, but Gary Borger really breaks it down that it's 90% presentation. And I don't know if it was in that book or Roderick Brown's book, Seasons of a Fisherman, but he talks about the idea that you could take a rubber molded version of an insect that looks literally exactly like an insect,
Mhm.
and you can fish it all you want. I'm certain it was Roderick Brown because he was talking about flies that the more chewed up they get, it's kind of like, does a tree fall in the forest and no one's around? Does it make a sound? When your flies get chewed up and the fishing is good and you've caught a fish on this fly and the fly has loose materials and it's getting a little shaggy, are you continuing to have good fishing because it's really good fishing that day, or are you having increasingly good fishing because that fly now has more movement with these really soft, very vulnerable materials? And
Mhm.
I believe Hag Brown's theory was it was about 50-50. It was like a lot of those flies, when they do get chewed up, those materials are now very agile and fluid in the water, and that will always outfish like the antithesis, which would be like a rubber molded version of an insect, which
Mhm.
you could certainly do. So,
Yeah, and I think Haig Brown, that would have been in the 60s and 70s, right? Like kind of the height of his time out there in the fishing actively. And so when you think about like what flies were available then for people to tie and fish and buy versus now, I think we've learned some things along that time frame. That was the theory of a golf ball used to be, I think, made out of a ball of lead. And as the player started playing with it, early in the game, the ball wouldn't fly as far. And as you got further into the game, it had more dimples and dents and bangs on it, and it would go further, they noticed. And so that's why golf balls have dimples on them, because it broke up the air turbidity or whatever, and it would fly farther because of the surface tension or surface area of the ball. So I do agree. I mean, I can point to times where as my fly got worse and worse, and I'm like, why are they even still hitting this? There's hardly anything left on this hook, and it was still working. And so I couldn't explain it per se, but and some flies just they just fall apart at that point. They don't function the way they're intended. But yeah, I think there's certain cases, certain insects that it does. It reflects light differently, maybe it moves differently, maybe. Um, yeah, I don't know. I wish I knew the answer exactly so I could replicate it. But another comment I'll add is, one of the things we use for indications of life is flash. So the right amount of crystal flash on a wing, let's say, also gives that impression that it's fluttering or moving, because it's like you said, maybe sunlight's coming through it, but it's a static wing, but you have crystal flash that's got all these little twists in it, and as the light is hitting it and it's moving, it's just like disco ball, right? Like you get a little bit of reflection coming through that static wing as it moves along. So it's just that hint of movement. So
Yeah, the
Um,
disco ball analogy is actually really accurate. I really like that. As that fly's tumbling downstream, that
mhm,
flash, at face value may not look like much, but under motion, it
mhm,
really is giving the impression that it's in a fight for its life.
mhm.
Let's break into some tips for tires. Somebody's getting started, or I think there's a lot of people out there sitting on materials that have kind of sidelined it for quite a while. When somebody's getting back into tying, do you have suggestions on patterns that would be both approachable and functional for somebody either jumping back in or starting tying for the first time?
I mean, I think it depends on what they're trying to do. If it's a wet fly, then I'm probably, it seems um, cliche, I think, because everyone talks about it, but still, I think there's nothing wrong with learning how to properly tie a woolly bugger, right? Like where you secured the hackle correctly with a wire, and that technique of, winding the hackle from the front back to the back and then coming up over it, cross, the hackle with your wire, and then you back secure it at the head and trim off the unused hackle at the back. That same technique, now that you've learned that technique, that same one applies to an elk hair caddis, where you've got your body, and then your hackle is tied at the front, the wires at the back, and you palmer the hackle back and run your wire back over the front, and then tie your wing in. So I think just learning those two techniques, let's say, gives you now a wet fly that can be used almost anywhere for a leech or anything. And then you've got this great little dry fly that, there's caddis in almost every river, and they're a pretty long hatch throughout spring into, late midsummer ish. And then you have October caddis in the fall. So, I mean, that covers two big swaths of food that a fish would see or eat. And, along those lines, like when you and I were learning, at best, we would have a book that had a picture and the ingredients of the fly, not even step by steps in a lot of cases. And so we just had to figure stuff out as we were trying to learn how to tie. Proportions, like, is that the right amount? I don't know. It's like just trial and error. But in today's day and age, the amount of videos that people can access, the amount of tutorials that are out there, the amount of step by steps, you can even Google a fly that you're interested in and then put the letters SBS for step by step after it. That's how everyone abbreviates it. So you can Google search a lot of flies and come up with step by steps for many, many of them. And it's so much easier to learn today than it was when we were learning. Um, so I think, with some really basic materials, I mean, for that matter, if you ever go to thrift shopping, like you can find old fly tying kits, like some so old that they had polar bear and stuff in them. Like, that's a fun find when you're in a thrift shop and you pick up a kit for $5 and it had polar bear in it. Um, so I don't know, just I think those are the easiest ways to
Yeah,
reintroduce it or be excited about trying some things.
I like what you said there because there are a lot of shortcuts to tying buggers. And I'll admit I don't tie mine. I don't reinforce them with wire. I
Mhm.
should, because they look good. It's the right way to do it. It makes the fly more durable. So
Mhm.
even I'm guilty of shortcuts, but I think yeah, the same with an elk hair caddis. That wire, obviously protects the hackle and keeps it intact. So even if that hackle breaks, it's more durable. It
Mhm.
looks great and it keeps the dubbing, secure and put together. But yeah, I think if a tire did that, you could tie a box full of jig head buggers in a variety of sizes and colors, make a few permutations with a couple of rubber legs. I mean, essentially, you're tying stonefly, something that could be fished as a stonefly nymph. Kind of I tie a sculpin that I call the shapeshifter sculpin because I'm not convinced they eat it as a sculpin all the time. I think they eat it as a big stonefly or a leech or just a critter. I don't even think
Right.
they know what it is. It's just
Right.
it moves and slithers through the water in a way that's, very attractive. But yeah, the elk hair caddis. And folks, the trout don't know the names of the bugs. If you're in a good mayfly hatch and you throw a caddis over it, 9 out of 10 times it's eating it.
Mhm.
But yeah, you can learn how to tie elk hair caddis in a few variety of sizes and colors. And with that, the skills that you're learning with the elk hair caddis, you're going to learn how to use a hair stacker. You're going to learn the difference between elk hair and deer hair, which are two very different materials. It's very critical. I would just use whatever hair I had. And, I learned the hard way after tying a lot of bugs with deer hair that it just doesn't float. Not
Mhm.
like elk hair. Elk hair is, obviously a much more buoyant, stiffer material.
Mhm.
Deer hair is too soft and becomes saturated. So I think there's a whole bunch of lessons within those two patterns that people can get because once they learn how to tie that, quote unquote chassis, that chassis can then be altered in different sizes and colors with small modifications. And they have a ton of different patterns available to them right within those two basic bugs.
Mhm. Yeah, it
The
also
other,
teaches you hackle sizing and the difference between a soft webby hackle of the bugger and a dry fly hackle with the stiff, barbs on it. And so, you do learn just some really key, even down to like how do you start putting your thread on the hook, and that pinch technique, and tying in a marabou tail without it rolling over and slipping out or whatever. Like, you just learn those real key basics to get started. And then once you get it, then you crank out a handful, you fill up a small section of your box with a bunch of elk hair caddis patterns, and then you go tackle a new pattern. I think that's one thing I once I started doing it more, I would learn one pattern and then just stick with it. And so the humpy was one that I fell in love with and painstakingly tried to get it right. And I had my own shortcut in tying that, and that came out of like I didn't want to waste material, right? And so to me, tying in the hump and the tail felt wasteful. Why couldn't I incorporate the wings into that equation and just do it all in one swath, right? So like it took some practice to get the wings set at the right length at the beginning, and then I could tie it in and run the hump back, and then I could have like a different kind of tail, like a moose tail or something that was a little stiffer. But I just almost did it in reverse, and then instead of tying the wings in separate, I was able to do it in one ticket basically. Um, but I tied humpies forever and fished them forever and fell in love with it. And then I remember tying my first parachute Adams and was just like, oh my gosh, this is a game changer, and so now I had a buggy fly, I had a mayfly, and so I I think if you fight the urge to tie one of something and then move on to something else and then on to something else, if you kind of can force yourself to stick with a pattern for a bit and get comfortable with it until you can tie it pretty well, then branch out and do it again, you'll start to build up the skills to start to tackle more and more stuff.
yeah, I would say looking back, I think that's super sound advice because again, back to the buggers, you learn how to tie a bugger really well. Well, obviously a size 12 brown woolly bugger, in a certain, color variation, meaning maybe we put black hackle over a brown body.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we run it with a tungsten bead on a jig head hook. Maybe we run it on a fairly straight eye hook for, lake fishing. Th that pattern, you could take the same exact tying skills and tie a number 4 olive, and you've got a great sculpin pattern, at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, you've got a big bugger. I would say the mistakes I made early on, I think is still guilty of making mistakes. I'm a very pragmatic tire. Is too much thread, too many wraps. More thread doesn't solve problems.
Mm-hmm.
3 to 4 wraps per material done well with the appropriate thread diameter. I would use the wrong thread constantly. I would use 3/0 thread in situations I should have been using 6 or 8/0. for those that aren't familiar with thread diameter, 3 is like a really big thread that we wouldn't really use for anything other than really aggressively lashing down large materials for durability. The 3/0 doesn't bite into materials very well. Then you have materials slipping out of place because it doesn't have a bite. It's just too big. So like using the wrong thread, using too many wraps of thread, and then not having the right color thread and some of these real subtleties that blend really well with the fly. Because
Mhm.
there's nothing uglier than tying a fly that really is a pretty well tied fly, and then something in that either the chenille color, the dubbing color, or the thread color just doesn't quite jive. It starts to tell a mixed story. And I think spending another, $4 on the right color and size of thread is a really critical component because that bobbin of thread is going to last for hundreds of patterns.
Mhm.
Just get the right color thread as
Yeah.
well. And then the other big mistake is I look back and I can picture that coffee can sitting on I think that coffee can has now been inherited by my youngest son, Jake, because
Mhm.
he's been tying quite a bit. Uh, his bedroom is an absolute mess with tying materials. But yeah, yeah, and he's got 100 different prototypes of different things, set out of all sorts of crazy variations. And I think that there's two lessons there. One, tie it one fly extremely well, even if it takes you 30 or 45 minutes. And then as long as that material or as long as that pattern doesn't have more than 4 or 5 materials,
Mhm.
you should be able to up that or increase your efficiency to the point where you're maybe in that fly for 5 or 6 minutes,
Mhm.
eventually. Once you get over about 4 or 5 materials, like that's becomes artistic. That's like a recreational tying experience. That's not a
Mhm.
pragmatic tying experience. And I think when people get started, keep it simple, stupid, keep
Mhm.
the materials to a minimum, and learn how to tie very functional patterns. The bugger that you suggested is what? Marabou, chenille, wire, hackle, four
Mhm.
materials.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh, for your commercially tied patterns, Patrick, I know this might be a crazy question, but do you have a goal on the number of materials you're kind of shooting for?
No, my approach is, I would say I do take what you just said, and the first one I tie, maybe the first 10 I try, I'm I'm a mess. I've got materials everywhere. I'm tying extremely slow. I'm, trying to get things like I might be solving one aspect of the fly at a time. So I'm really painstakingly kind of working through it. And I fight the urge because I want to go faster. And I tell myself, like, that's not, I have to back myself back up and slow down. Um, and then once I've got a fly to a done point, and then I have to tie the exact samples to send to a factory, then I'll oftentimes have a stopwatch out, and I'll just kind of, as I'm tying each one, I'm kind of timing myself to see what I think this is taking. And then that helps me understand, factories tying it, are they tying this many a day or this many a day? And like, what's that? What am I sending over to them? And is this worth it? And so I have a good understanding of the kind of the pain that goes into it. And and as far as materials go, I do what I just take it too far. So I put all the stuff in it that I think I need at the time or want in it. And then I'm like, okay, I don't need that because I can't even see it in there, right? Like I added something, but now I can't see it in there because it's so buried. So take that out. This isn't functional anymore. So I'm going to remove that. And then I'll back it up to a point where I think these are the essentials I need to keep in the fly to make it do or look the way I want. And then I try to go from there. So I I kind of go too far forward and then back it back up.
That's a really good way to do it, actually. Just make a salad and then take out the
Mhm.
stuff that doesn't
Exactly.
doesn't taste
Get
good,
those
or you
olives out of there, man.
that's a really good way to do it. Regarding the timing, I'm not this anal retentive, but I will tell you, like, somebody who really does want to become a proficient tyer and they have a pattern that they really like,
Mhm.
and I tie some crane flies that, I went through a similar transition. For years, I could not find a crane fly on the market. By the way, you tied me a couple prototypes. You remember those ones?
Oh
Can
yeah.
am I allowed to describe kind of what's in that bug?
Sure.
Okay, so there's is that kind of that sparkle vernal, that larva, not larva lace, but like it's a braided material that was the body, and you burned it on the end,
Hmm.
and that was the body, which kind of looks like a tail, and then you ran a really nice parachute hackle around a foam post with a little tiny foam piggyback. You know the one I'm talking about?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So that thing kicked butt the other day. That was like 2 years ago. You gave me that thing. That thing
Oh,
absolutely kicked butt the other day.
um,
But that would be a really good example of, pattern that I hope to be able to tie for myself. But if I was to time the various steps going through it, like chapters, I could be like, okay, the body is really easy. This stage is really easy. This stage is really easy. And then, God, I'm spending 8 minutes on this part of that fly.
mhm,
How do I take that 8 minute portion of that fly or that 8 minute chapter and go, do I really need to do it that way, or is there a 1 minute fix that I can accomplish 90% of it? And I think if people were to look at these patterns, they really like tying. Maybe there's like one part of it that takes forever,
mhm,
and that would be a great place to go. Do I need it, or how do I do it differently? But I've never thought about timing the different steps
mhm.
within the pattern itself. But I do. I look at my watch all the time because I'm usually under the gun. I'm usually drinking a cup of coffee, trying to knock out 6 bugs in the morning. And
Yeah.
Patrick, I used to tie a lot
Hmm.
uh, during guided trips, especially in the
Hmm.
fall, because
Hmm.
that's my burnout time, man. I'm been guiding all summer, and I don't really want to tie before I guide. I don't really want to tie after I guide, but I will set up a lunch table and I'll tie 4 flies at lunch, and then we would fish those 4 flies. Hopefully, they would last all afternoon, and
Hmm.
then people could understand that maybe these aren't disposable as well. And I felt like people lost less flies when they
Hmm.
actually saw them tied as well. But I shoot for about 4 materials per pattern. Once I get
Hmm.
to that 5 number, I feel like I'm confusing the message. It's hard to get that many materials to really blend and balance together for me. So I try to keep it really pretty straightforward. But again, back to like these couple of tips I shared for folks, like I think thread is overlooked as like having the right thread, the right color, the right diameter, use less thread, and then be careful with the super glue. Like people think super glue is going to fix everything, and designing the fly in a way that's going to be relatively durable. I actually dislike using super glue at the end of the pattern.
Hmm.
There are times I will put a little dab of glue in the mid stages that then I can tie over it. But man, I don't know how many times I've tied these beautiful flies and been like, okay, we're gonna make this thing durable. I put a little Zappa Gap on there, and then pretty soon I got a leg glued to the wing. It
Hmm.
gets all foggy and nasty looking. The hackle gets way too stiff,
Yeah.
because I got a little smudge of glue on there. So
Hmm.
the other one is I think people overuse glue as
Hmm.
well. I think there's no glue is not a substitute for good tying technique.
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely I've done the same. I use super glue to, like let's say it's a chenille body. Before I wrap my chenille forward, I'll put a little, base of super glue on it and then wrap my chenille up over it. And that is going to help it keeping from unraveling if it gets chewed up. It's just going to give a little more durability to that fly, but it's very easy to cover up that glue and it's not going to get everywhere. You get one shot at it though, right? If you put a gap in your chenille, you're not backing it up because it glued it down. And I definitely really try to not use it at the end because I'm the same. I'll get it somewhere it shouldn't be. I've spilled that stuff so many times. I've ruined my pants because I've poured it on my leg. I, stick my fingers together constantly. Like I am a mess when it comes to super glue. And I do try to dip a bodkin in it if I can, so I can be a little more precise if I need to be precise with it. But certain materials soak it up like a sponge, like that, flexi floss stuff. Dude, do not touch super glue to that. It'll make it so stiff and it'll bend it weird and you'll never get it back. Like it just ruins it. So yeah, I mean head cement, right? Like that's what it's for. And put a little head cement on the end of your thread wrap when you're done and just kind of help lock that down so it's not easily coming untied and you're good. I think threads diameters, they have they come in deniers or in aught sizes or whatever. And I like, the 136 denier, which is a 6/0, for a lot of stuff. And then I use like go half of that. So like a 70 denier um, for your smaller stuff. And if you just had those two to get started, that covers a lot of things. And I think you could do black safely. I think you could do a brown safely. And if you, like when I went through a phase of trying to save money on that, and thread is pretty cheap, but I just only bought white, and I tied everything with white thread. And then wherever it was going to be showing and I didn't want it to be white, I just took a marker to it and, color it the color I needed, and it was done. So, yeah, that's
I
the.
just looked. Thread's $4.50 a spool. We sell the Vivas.
Mhm.
And yeah, I historically haven't worked in din strength. I've always, worked in aught.
Mhm.
It's been, I mean, I've got so many materials, man. I could probably tie for the next 10 years pretty avidly and not need more stuff, although I do find myself wandering through the fly tying section, probably looking at something that I already have. I need
Mhm.
to get a little bit more organized as I begin to tie this winter. But yeah, $4.50 for a spool thread. I think having the right stuff is really important. If somebody's jumping into this, like, could you give us obviously, like, we're not going to dive into like the materials, like, because that's going to be dictated by the fly that they need. But could you just give us an outline of like the very basic and essential tool set that somebody would need to just start, functional and pragmatic tying of trout flies?
So first you would need a bobbin to hold your thread and to, wrap your thread around the hook. So it doesn't have to have tensioners on it or anything like that. It just needs to hold it. And I do tell people to get one with a ceramic insert, because if you just get a straight metal tube, you're just asking to cut your thread constantly on the end of it. So as long as it has some kind of a protective liner in there, much like our stripping guides would have it. If you don't have that ceramic insert in there, your line's going to get trashed quickly. So I
So
do
buy
say
a good bobbin.
buy a decent bobbin. I mean, you can get them. I don't know. I can't remember the prices, but yeah, the ceramic insert version isn't that much more. Um,
I want to I want to comment on that because I just learned something because I've probably got 10 bobbins
mhm.
and I run, I'll leave thread rigged up on different bobbins, then I just grab that bobbin and I've honestly never paid attention to which ones are ceramic and which ones aren't. And now that you mention that, I'm like, yeah, my thread will break really spontaneously sometimes. And I'm like, what the heck? I'm like, this
Mhm.
thread should be more consistent than this. I'm very, I know how much I can pull, how
Mhm.
much tension I can pull. And yeah, it's my bobbins. I'm
Mhm.
sure that's exactly what it is. I gotta go through an audit and on my run my light thread on my ceramic ones and then my
Yeah.
my standard steel ones or brass, whatever the element is. I'll run my heavy thread on those.
Yeah. Or sometimes I'll put lead or wire on those because then they don't, it doesn't matter.
That's a
Uh,
great tip.
a
Great tip.
pair of scissors, and I like 4 inches long. I feel like that's a good utilitarian length to get in and out of stuff. I like the razor kind that are have a little serrated aspect to it, like a micro serration on it. Those seem to hold an edge pretty long and can cut fairly precisely for most things I do. And then um, when I find my scissors are dulling out or getting to just where they're not functioning, then I take them out of rotation and I color the handles bright red with a Sharpie. And then I know, don't use this for actual tying work, but you can use it now to cut wire or lead or whatever. And that's the fastest way to ruin a good pair of scissors is start cutting the wrong stuff with it, right? You cut, I don't know if your mom ever sewed or had nice sewing scissors, but you dare touch those and she'd light you up, right? Like you don't mess with my nice scissors. You get the ones out of the drawer. So that's how my tying scissors are. Like, they're they have to do some precision work. And the second I start getting lazy and cutting wire with it, I'm just ruining them faster. So uh, anyway, so get a decent pair of scissors, comfortable on your hands. Like if they're pinching your thumb or your finger when they're on, they're using them. Don't use that pair. Get a pair with a bigger opening for your thumb and finger to sit in. Um,
Do you tie with your scissors in your hand,
at
or do you
times,
set
yeah,
your scissors down
I
between?
typically set them down. I'm not, that's the commercial tying move where you're trying to crank stuff out. You keep it in your hand, and I can do it, but I'm not usually commercial tying. I'm not tying for speed, so I put them down. And there's a little, this is a little hack, but like there's a little tensioner bolt on the side of the scissors a lot of times, so you can kind of tighten it up and change how it cuts. If you put that side down, it tips your scissors up just slightly to make it easier to pick up. So if they're just on the other side, where they're very flat on the table, they're a little trickier to get, but you just flip it over. Or, they make little tool caddies and stuff that you can mount to your vise or have next to you. So you can just put them tip down in that. They're super easy to get and they never disappear. I lay them down in different places and then I go looking for them. Can't figure out where I left it. So yeah, bobbin scissors. Then I would say you need a whip finisher. It'd be another essential one that I think people should have. Um, it's some people love to just whip finish with their fingers. I hated it. I still hate it. I can do it, but I don't like it. I'm so efficient with a whip finisher. And if you learn how to use it, it's precise, it's clean, and it ties a good knot. So
Yeah, I'm a whip finish guy too. I can do it with my fingers, but I can get way more tension in it. And I'll do 2 or 3 whip finishes real quick. I'll do like a 6 to 8 spins on my first knot, 4 spins and then just 2 spins, and I can do it in just a matter of seconds. And
mhm.
my again, super glue is not a substitute for good tying technique. Whip finishers are $8. I think it's a given. I totally agree that it's an essential piece of equipment.
Yeah. And I don't know if I'd have to think about if there's any others that I would deem essential. I mean, I guess if you want to stack hair, you need to have a hair stacker. Like you can hand stack that to a degree, but it's never going to come out as clean as a hair stacker will do it. And they make some cool varieties these days. So um, I think it's
And
neat to have a bodkin as the other one would be. You can pick out fibers that are trapped. You can apply glues. You can pierce foam to thread something through it. There's all kinds of uses for a bodkin. Um, so I would probably put that on the essential list. And then the hair stacker would be on the list for people that only want to do that. So
yeah, a vice, being a given, right?
yeah.
That's just gonna assume if people have listened this long, they probably know that a vice is essential. But we sell some kits for $85.
Mm-hmm.
And the kit comes with a bobbin, a bodkin, a threader, a whip finish tool, a hackle plier, a 4-inch scissor, and a hair stacker. 85 bucks in a vise, and people have got the hardware that they need to. I mean, I don't use tools. That's it. I mean, beyond that, it's very, very affordable. And then obviously you're going to pick up materials, which are, you know, generally not unique to a particular pattern. Once you buy a material pack, it could be used for a lot of different things. Um, so this is not an insurmountable investment for people to get into. I think it's just something that people got to be inspired and love fly fishing, and the satisfaction of catching fish on flies that you've tied yourself. It's just a heightened experience. I
Yeah.
don't know if there's a ratio, but you know, if removing myself from kind of an outfitter's position, if I was to go fishing, and I think I'm likely to catch more fish if I'm an avid tire. I really do think I'm going to be more successful, but I could probably catch half the fish exclusively on flies I tied and be more satisfied. Because
Mhm.
I think that there's an intrinsic value to creating something and then fooling a trout on your own creation.
Yeah. No, I think especially if you if you're, let's say you're at it for a couple days, right? So you fish this, you're going to fish the same area, and you know, picture you're on a camping trip and you're at a lake or whatever, and you have your tying stuff with you. So day one, you go out and you're fishing and you're not getting anything, but you see a, a beetle or something on the water and how it's swimming, and you're like, man, I bet I could modify this fly to look like that, or I could tie something that looks like that. And then you go back and then you do it, and you go back and you catch the fish the next day. That's incredibly satisfying because you witnessed it, you came up with a solution, and then you went and tested it and it worked. It's very fulfilling.
I agree. I love catching fish on flies that I tie.
Mhm.
I like tying them for guided clients. I love tying them for myself. There's a difference there.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're probably running up on time now, but yeah, any concluding inspirations for folks that are kind of on the fence, thinking this might be for them?
Um, I mean, I think it just is. I don't even want to say it's your seriousness to it. I think it's just how much you want to invest into something that you love. There's casual anglers, there's people who, you know, go a handful of times a year, and you should be able to just go buy the stuff you need and prepare, in preparation for your trip. And that's great. And the people that are fishing constantly are are probably more inclined to want to tie something that, like some people only will ever tie their steelhead flies. They'll never buy one, but they'll buy their trout flies. There's people that only tie their saltwater flies for tarpon, let's say, but they'll buy their bonefish flies, right? So it's like maybe there's an aspect that you have a little more interest in or desire in, and so you focus on that, and then leave the rest to the commercial flies. So, um, yeah, I think just the advice would be, if it's something that you have all ever expressed an interest in, it's easy to go. In my opinion, I think it's easy to go, get a kit and just, you know, go dabble with it and see if you do love it. Because just like any hobby, you can always make it more expensive and more, add more things to it, but don't do it on the front end. Like, just start with the core basics and dabble and play with some things, and get your feet wet, and you can always grow it. So,
Yeah, it doesn't take long to recoup the investment. Even if you just tied buggers or Chernobyl ants, you're going to recoup the investment materials really quickly. And I think that my concluding thoughts, I think you're going to become a more invested angler. I think folks that tie their bugs fish them more passionately. They fish more. It's easier to set an afternoon aside or hop out of bed in the morning or even fish when conditions are difficult because they've
mhm.
got skin in the game. And I just think there's a difference between anglers I meet that are tying their own bugs, and it's okay to still buy bugs. You're not gonna tie everything that you need.
Mhm.
That's I wouldn't say it's a completely ludicrous concept, but I think you're still going to buy things that are specialties. You're going to buy things that you'll buy one or two of them and try them. If you have success, then, well, let me figure out how to now replicate this in some quantity that's, going to last me, the balance of the fishing season.
Mhm.
So I think the idea that you have to tie everything is not right. You're still going to buy a few bugs. You're going to buy a few for prototypes and testing. But I would just strongly encourage people to get back on the vise if you haven't done it in a while, and if you're just kind of curious about it, there's great kits. We got a bunch of them at Reds. I also think I I don't, I've always seemed to come across somebody who's getting rid of a lot of flying material. They age out. They're like, hey, I'm done with it. Either they age out in the sense that they're just older and they're not fishing or tying anymore, or they're just done with it. They did it for 15, 20 years. Like, I haven't used this in 5 years.
Mhm.
I need to free myself of this burden. So maybe you know somebody, especially, and if you're listening to this podcast and you've got excess tying materials, vices, that kind of stuff, find a young, ambitious person with good
Mhm.
eyesight and more time than economic resources, like I was at one point. And gift them some materials.
Mm.
You might change the trajectory of their life, and I mean that with full sincerity. So
Yeah, and I mean, anytime you can mentor people, I think is awesome because you're just laying the groundwork for that next generation of anglers and river stewards and stuff. But you know, I found myself in a full circle moment. We just had a family reunion a couple weeks ago, and one of my cousin's daughters came up to me, and she had tied a fly with her grandpa, and she had it with her. The hook had been cut off, so it was just the shank and the fly. But she was so excited to come show me because she knew what I did for work. And it just was so awesome to, be able to encourage her and talk about what materials were on that fly and where she would use it and all these things. And it just was so, I don't know, like I could picture myself doing that with my uncle when I was really young. I'd come and show him the flies that I had tied recently, and he would ask me questions about it and, kind of challenge me on some things or whatever. So I just felt like all of a sudden the roles had reversed, and now I'm the, older, I hate to say how old I am now, but like that, I'm just the old guy now. And I've got this younger generation coming and showing me their stuff, which is just so fun.
yeah, it's got to be incredibly satisfying. Well, we got to pick out a day to go fishing here pretty soon, and then we'll probably do this again, after a day of fishing at some point, or hopefully this fall.
Yeah.
But anyway, thanks a ton for coming on, Patrick. Always appreciate your well thought out insight on just fishing and tying in general. And yeah, really appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks, man. I hope the your new tying section is going well over there. It looks beautiful, great expansion, and yeah, I do want to get over and fish. I've been eyeing the temperatures uh, to see when the cooler nights start because I think maybe a bass fishing trip could be in order and get those last feed bag moments of these fish.
There's a lot of options. All right, thanks a ton, Pat.
Yeah, man. Talk to you soon, Joe.